Andrew, we're at the very end of the canal where it spills out into the Ottawa River, which is called Entrance Bay, but it had another name. The first name it was given was Sleigh Bay, because in March 13th, I think it was, 1817, a wedding took place here on the frozen Ottawa River. And it was a sort of a royal wedding of sorts. It was the Wright family. The youngest son was getting married, and he married Charlotte Holt, better known as Lottie Holt. So you can just picture the scene, that you have all of the sleighs with their bells ringing, and people are wrapped up in their furs and coming out onto the Ottawa River, the frozen Ottawa River, to Sleigh Bay here, creating a circle to have this wedding. The minister probably came from Perth because there was no minister in Wrightstown at that time. And from that time on, they called this Sleigh Bay. I like that name better than Entrance Bay.
Yeah, it's very nice. Yeah. Well, we've come down on one of the iciest patches I've seen on the bike path just below Parliament Hill, which you can see the library up here. And there's the remnants of an old building that I've passed by many times. I only discovered what it was in the last few months. So you can describe what it is.
I've only discovered what it was in the last few months. A researcher has I was in touch with, put some information out. He did quite a bit of the research because everybody was fooled by this one article that was put out by a University of Ottawa researcher a few years back that said this was a steam mill, a steam sawmill. And, isn't that cool with all of the timber rafts below it and everything else? It was a neat thing to have that linked Ottawa and Bytown to the Parliament Hill.
Yeah.
It's not. It was a pump house.
Oh.
So when the Parliament buildings were built, they put in a pump house. They thought it would be far more efficient to just take the water straight out of the Ottawa River to essentially not only for the Parliament precinct, but also for the federal buildings that were being built at that time.
So that was pre-electricity, I would assume. So would there have been like a steam engine running it?
Precisely. That was it exactly. So this was the pump house.
Yeah.
And this is the foundation. You can see all the remedial work that's being done to restore it and make sure that it's something that will always be there.
Yeah, very cool. So we've walked maybe 50 to 100 meters from where we just were, and we're in a spot that was called Brewery Bay. What's the story behind that?
Well, the original name was Brewery Bay because somewhere around between 1819 and 1830, there was a brewery, a functioning, working brewery that sat right just to my right over here. And it was operating in this place, operated by, we think, Ralph Smith, who was the famed brewer, distiller of that day. He actually began working with Philemon Wright first in Philemon Wright's distillery brewery, which was the first in the Ottawa Valley. One of the first in Canada, in fact, that was a long functioning brewery. That was built in 1813. So this one here gave the name to the bay, Brewery Bay, but the brewery didn't last long, and this bay became known better as one of the many rafting bays of this area of Bytown particularly. So the cribs had come one by one down the slides, and this is where they would reassemble them into the giant timber rafts, right here. Now the great thing I love about Brewery Bay, though, is that I love the idea that between Supreme Court and Parliament Hill, there's a place called Brewery Bay. For me, that works.
So we've come down across the path that you can see over behind us, over onto Richmond Landing, past the naval monument that's up here. And you had something of interest that you wanted to point out that's over here.
Absolutely. Richmond Landing was originally called Bellows Landing because Caleb Bellows had a store here, a store probably in the tavern as well. We're not far from Mother Firth's Tavern too, which we're not going to talk about much, but or at all today. But you know, in honor of Brewery Bay and Caleb Bellows, I think we should have at least given Mother Firth a mention. So this was here Bellows Landing. We're basically at the foot of the National Archives, and right in this area here, T.W. Edwin Souter says that there was a rough stockade. There was an old fort, if you will, indigenous fort probably, and the rough stockade was usually just planted cedar stumps that were put as a rough wall, and it was a defensive fort. Now one might ask why there would be a defensive fort in this area. Well, an interesting story. Everybody probably knows the history of the Battle of the Lonceau, which is Dollard des Ormeaux, the 25-year-old man who basically saved Montreal, if you will, from an attack that was coming down the river. He went upstream to what is apparently Lonceau, according to historians, and that's where the battle took place. Now, the interesting thing is that there are two historians who have done a thorough reading of the report from one of the survivors of the Battle of the Lonceau. And he said that it was a 6-day paddle up the river to get to the Chaudière. Now, the Lonceau was never called the Chaudière, and the Lonceau was only a 3-day paddle from Montreal. Huh. So the two historians believe that the Battle of the Lonceau did not actually take place in Lonceau. It actually took place right here, right in front of Richmond Landing.
And what year would that have been again?
1660, I believe.
Wow, 1660.
Yep.
What's also amazing about this area for me is that all of the old photos that you see when the lumber industry was at its peak, this entire area, including this landing and next to us over here at Victoria Island, were just stacked sky high with lumber, I guess probably until they had the Great Fire.
And when you had those stacks of lumber, you'd look down the Ottawa River and you could swear you could walk across it because it would be entirely covered in sawdust.
Yeah, the good old days.
Wasn't a pretty sight. The good old days. So Andrew, you're always wondering where I do all my research. And right behind me is, of course, the National Archives. No, it's right here. This bench is called the Secret Bench of Knowledge. I sit here and it just gets absorbed.
I was going to make a Depends underwear joke.
Depends.
So we've walked down a little bit ways down Wellington. We're at the corner of Bay Street, just near Lyon. And this building that's behind us is covered in scaffolding and Tyvek, is apparently where Nicholas Sparks had his house.
Exactly right. His house was built between 1825 and 1830 when he married Sally Olmsted Wright. And obviously Wellington Street looked very, very different back then. It was a rough road, and his house would have been the only house standing there at first when he first built it. He had a beautiful front yard. So the back of his house was right on what today is Sparks Street, and his whole front yard was lined in flowers, and he had a stable with racehorses there. So this street looked very, very different. From his house, he could look straight down to the Ottawa River, and he'd have an unfettered view of the Chaudière Falls as well. Must have been quite spectacular. Looks kind of different today.
We're in the final spot of this ramble, and we're in front of Parliament Hill and the Peace Tower that everybody knows so well. But there's one last thing that people probably don't know about Parliament Hill.
Could you imagine how different Ottawa would look if what we had right behind us, instead of the Parliament buildings, was Old Fort Ottawa?
No kidding.
Because when they built the canal, the idea was, of course, to have a route And they said it was for military purposes, a route from Montreal to Kingston that would be safer than going down the St. Lawrence River. But there's a whole other layer there, Andrew, and that is that it was supposed to be part of a canal system that actually would go all the way up the Ottawa River, all the way to Georgian Bay. And there was a plan that that would be built. The Rideau Canal was part one, that would have been part two. And the way it turns out is that trains began to be used. They laid tracks all over Canada, and the canal became obsolete. It was a local industrial canal for the longest time, and now it is the recreational canal that it is today.
Very cool. Maybe we should do one about the canal.
Indeed.
So that should about do it for this ramble. Thanks very much for watching, and if you haven't already, please subscribe, and if you want to get a chance to see the rest of the videos that we're going to be putting out.
And if any of you ever want to follow that walk, write down some notes, do the walk, and I suggest at the end of it, grab yourself a pint over at Darcy McGee's or something.
Yeah, or Tavern on the Hill.
Tavern on the Hill, absolutely. Best hot dog in town. You're not going to get one this time of the year, though.
No.
Yeah.
And save up for it, they're expensive.